This is In the Black, a leadership, strategy and business podcast brought to you by CPA Australia.
Welcome to In the Black. My name is Jackie Blondell. Today we are talking about how governments and businesses worldwide are working towards a zero-carbon future. This delicate balancing act involves carbon-intensive industries, the communities that surround them, and the huge structural changes we will need to make in the future. PwC Australia estimates that the livelihoods of about 300,000 Australians could be affected by changes in the energy sector. We talk about how we might achieve a just transition to a zero-carbon future with Patrick Viljoen. Patrick grew up in a mining town, became an accountant, and is now a senior manager at CPA Australia, focusing on environmental, social, and governance issues. Hello, Patrick.
Hi, Jackie.
Can you tell us what the term just transition actually means?
There's a lot of talk around, transition into a lower carbon state. So when we talk about transitioning, what we're effectively saying is for the last couple of decades, if not centuries, we've been dependent on fossil fuels to power economies and to power the way that we do life. We're aware that with the impacts of climate change, we're moving into a lower carbon state. So breaking that umbilical cord that we have to fossil fuels and a dependence on things like oil and coal. With that comes implications on organizations and businesses because we're expecting them to move into that lower carbon state. And that has impacts on strategy. It's got impacts on your business model, your risk management. There's a whole host of things that you need to consider. Taking the example of coal, just to use as an illustration, if we're now moving to say we're going to shut a coal mine, that has a social implication because what you tend to find with coal mining or any kind of mining is that that is beholden to societies that live in that space, that operate as miners. And that could be a generational thing. It could be the dad, the son, the granddad. Everyone's been working on that particular mine. That's not the only problem. What we're now saying is not only are we saying mines should be shutting down, we're saying all mines should be shutting down. So there's no alternative to go to. The problem with the just transition is how do we move that group of people along on the journey? So if we're going to move into lower carbon energy production, how do we make sure that their skills are transferable into the new world that we're living in? So in effect, leaving nobody behind because we're transitioning. And that's where the just transition comes in. It's recognizing the social aspect of this transition into a lower carbon state.
Germany had a huge coal industry until about the mid-1980s when its giant Zollverein coal mine was shut down. That coal mine has since become a UNESCO-listed tourist attraction. Now, not all coal mines can become listed tourist attractions. What else can they be transformed into?
Yeah. So in terms of that whole conversion, usually when we have decommissioning happening, particularly within mining, there's a whole raft of activities that kicks off because there should be rehabilitation and just making sure that there's no scars left behind. It's beholden to organizations to do that.
That's the environmental side.
That's the environmental side of it. So in isolation of society, but let's just look at the environmental stuff. As part of that, there's obviously then opportunities in terms of what you can do with that space in particular. Mm-hmm. So with the Zollverein, it was interesting in terms of creating that as part of a UNESCO World Site. So they're using it in terms of saying, get people in, get tourist money flowing in, and also showcasing a very good example of how you can change a mine or a decommissioned mine into something good. So that's basically just this whole concept of making sure that, if there's money flowing in from tourism, obviously coming back to the infrastructure, there's shops and other things, and you're driving that employment within that particular area. It's making sure that there is that continuation of society and livelihoods.
I've looked at the website and we'll include the website in the show notes. There's stunning 1930s brutalist buildings that are an example of
style.
Yeah, an example of the Industrial Revolution. But not all coal mining towns or mining towns have that kind of potential to have a UNESCO-listed tourist site as a money generator. What else can these mining communities do?
So just reflecting on what happens in the United States, and there was some statistics in terms of what happens to mines once they decommission. By and large, what you find is they talk about rehabilitation to grasslands. So it's just, making sure that everything's flat, planting seed and creating a grassland. Now, that in and of itself is an option. It's sort of a lazy option because what you're failing to understand is that there was topography that existed prior to the mine being there. And you're not replicating that. So you're creating something which is still artificial to that area. The second component that they talk about is creating opportunities for wildlife and fishery. So creating lakes, which also, if you go back to the Ruhr Valley, that's exactly what they did, right? There were lakes being created, which is now used for picnicking and other social kind of pursuits. So that can happen as well. The problem with that is there's no external assurance that's placed on the viability or the success of these kind of ventures, right? So if we're talking about lakes, the first thing that comes to mind is, and I grew up in a mining town myself, so I know sort of firsthand about these impacts. But there's acidic fallout as part of the mining, which seeps into the water table. And it would be interesting in terms of if there's research out there that can start looking in terms of placing a value on that, saying, is the soil yield that you can generate if you do go through that rehabilitation process, is it still viable? Can you actually sustain societies from that earth? A bigger problem, which is unseen, and it's, pardon the pun, but it's below the surface, is the fact that if you go back to the Ruhr Valley example, they talk about the earth is actually Swiss cheese because there's so many tunnels and caverns and stuff which has happened, or a part and parcel of the mining and excavation and extraction operations, that causes the risk of sinkholes. So, there's all these kind of things that you need to think about in terms of how you do that rehabilitation properly. But mostly it's creating grasslands and then creating opportunities for wildlife and for fisheries. Like I say, it does come at a risk.
What about the community around it? Because having grasslands, lakes, that sort of thing does provide a bit of recreation for people, but does it provide an income that can help prop up the community?
And again, this comes back to what is the main driving source. It's always very risky, I think, from a societal perspective, if a whole community is beholden to a single employer, right? If you think about, let's use a car manufacturer as an example. So if you've been to Sweden and you've been to Gothenburg, Volvo's main production plant is outside of Gothenburg. It's in a valley kind of area, and there's a whole community that was built around this factory. The problem is if you speak to the average person in Gothenburg, 1 out of, let's say, 5, and I'm plucking these numbers out of thin air, but 1 out of 5 would say, I either work for Volvo or I know of somebody that works for Volvo at that particular plant. If that plant was to fail, you can imagine what the kind of impact on society would be because, overnight people lose their jobs and livelihoods. So talking about rehabilitation of mines, and again, it sounds like we're having a pot shot at mines. We'll talk about other industries in a minute, but unless we can have that transition switch over, so unless you have a situation where you're moving from coal and you're moving into, say, for example, wind generation or whatever, that falls by the wayside. So it's how do we make sure that we're not requiring those people to move either. So you're not saying uproot your whole life and move to another town. Because
that seems particularly heartless, really, and that's why there's some pushback, I imagine.
Yes, and so it's making sure that whatever we have as an alternative can make sure that the economy still happens or thrives within that particular space. And this is not something which you can leave till the very last minute because then it's too late. Yeah. So it's about how do we start building in transition plans and look to the future to say potentially this could happen. You're not leaving people exposed by just sitting on your hands basically doing nothing.
What other industries are vulnerable in the future and how do the just transition principles apply to them?
Yeah, so if we think about other industries out there, and unfortunately we have to talk about the heavy emitters, then you're talking about industries like steel, which uses carbon not only for heating, but it also uses carbon as part of the process of converting ore to steel. Another big one is cement production, which also releases CO2. And the third one is chemicals. So, the kind of stuff that we use on a daily basis and how that is produced. Those 3 industries in and of themselves are susceptible to a risk because of transition to lower carbon, because they still produce carbon in quite a big fashion. The problem is the demand for steel and the demand for cement is not going to wane
I was going to ask you that. What about the green alternatives, green concrete, green steel? And
there are alternatives.
Yeah.
So in terms of, look, I'm not a chemist or a scientist, so I'm not going to go down the avenue of trying to explain that because I'm bound to sort of, get it wrong. There are alternatives, and I've read about the alternatives that they speak about in terms of how do you review the process that you're utilizing and make it more, carbon, not as carbon intensive, let's phrase it that way. And they do exist. The problem is it's not at scale yet. So even if you do start shifting into that, there's no way that they will be able to fulfill the demand by only using things like recycled steel or whatever. It's just not possible.
Now, what about on the other side of the equation? Like, we've got new energy industries that we have started to use in solar and wind and so on. Are there opportunities for communities that may have had an old style industry to move to these new style industries, or is that just not possible?
It is, but again, it's in terms of how do you plan around that. And if you look at the Powering Australia policy piece, and this was an election piece that Labor went to the polls with. The Powering Australia policy also links to regional power generation. So basically what we're saying here is there's a recognition that if you look at the regions, or regional Australia more broadly, there is a proportionately higher instance of unemployment and lack of job opportunities. But what the government is actively trying to do is to push the power production back into the regions. So you're safeguarding to a large degree societies and the way that they live and produce and sort of get income. Then we're talking about solar, massive solar farms. We're talking about wind power generation, all these kind of things. And it's how do we make sure that those people can draw down from that technology, also can provide their skills in terms of operating, these kind of machinery and production plants and taking them along. So it can happen, but there's a lot of planning that needs to happen ahead of time. And again, this is the big problem. If you don't have a clear view of when all of these things will happen and plan around that, you run the risk of it being this mad rush at the end and we get it wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. So can we maybe talk about timelines? Like it took 50 years to get from horses to cars, dung to smog. So what sort of timeline are we talking now? I mean, technology and the whole digital revolution is speeded things up so quickly. Imperatives around climate have caused us to have, very squeezed timelines. How long should just transition take?
I'm going to use a piece of terminology that I hate, and I hate it when people tell me this because, accountants like to operate in, definitives. It depends.
I thought you were going to say it depends.
It depends. There's a couple of drivers behind that. So we know in terms of the ambition that we have in terms of our own carbon emission targets as a country, we've upped that quite substantially from what it was in the past. So that ambition's been baked into the system. So that's good. Then you've got the regulation angle, because we are aware of the fact that, the International Sustainability Standards Board, they're producing their first 2 standards, which will be launched Q2, hopefully. And we're already starting to see the conversations from Treasury saying, how do we make that mandatory within the Australian environment? How do we roll that out? So regulation's coming and organizations are aware of this. So that's the push factor. The other push factor that we find is from a stakeholder perspective. It's that discerning kind of purchasing decisions that we see happening. So, people wanting to know, how did this product arrive at this point of me purchasing it? How much carbon's been embedded in the process? Was there child slavery involved, to talk about modern slavery? There's that level of discernment in terms of how we purchase, where we purchase, and looking at the product with more scrutiny. So all of these things combine to drive the momentum behind the change to that lower carbon state. The problem is, if one of those spokes, if you want to view it in a wheel kind of fashion, if one of those spokes starts underperforming, it goes a bit wobbly. So it's making sure that from all of those kind of viewpoints, we're doing the right thing. And look, at the moment, I'm tentatively sort of happy with the way we're going, because I think there's that drive from government, there's a drive from the regulators, and you're seeing that sort of groundswell of support coming through.
Well, business has been on the front foot for quite a few years, hasn't it, in terms of wanting to see clarity there.
Yeah, and even if you look at, super funds and the way they invest, and, they are thinking about ESG credentials, and that's being built into parameters for investment decisions. So all of these things combine, but I don't have a crystal ball to say we'll reach point X by then. It does depend.
We hope you're enjoying In the Black. If you're interested in the latest news, analysis, policy updates, and business insights, you should check out CPA Australia's With Interest podcast. Join us as we dive into the news and delve into the business issues of the day. Each week, we talk to thought leaders from across the accounting, finance, strategy, economic, and business spectrum. And you? get their expert opinions. Now, back to In the Black. I don't know whether this can work as an idea, but let's take it to a community level. Say, what would in terms of planning for a just transition? We should obviously be starting now with these communities in terms of skills, new industries, environmental cleanup. Should that be something be starting now, and should we be looking at like a 50-year evolution?
Yeah. I've been talking about planning and I've been talking about all these things, and I just want to make it clear, I'm not saying that mining companies don't do that. They do, right? There are protections in place in terms of the legislative framework that says you can't just abandon a mine, right? So there has to be this rehabilitation work and all of these things. So they know what the finite lifespan of that particular mine would be, and that factors into the way you plan. So Norway has got a very similar situation to Australia, right? They've got a dependence on a natural resource, oil in their case, which they know they need to shift out of. What the Norwegian government has started doing is actively seeking education programs to make sure that oil rig workers have the potential to take their skills and transfer that into whatever this new world would look like. And even if they want to transfer out, to sort of upskill them into something else if they wanted to move, career-wise into something else. So that's being provided already, and the government's proactively doing that. To a certain degree, and, it's not my place to take pot shots at the government, but that feels in the Australian context that it's missing, or we're not focusing on that as much, is the training and the education piece that backs the just transition. I feel if we could quantify that and put money behind that, that would be great.
Now, accountants and business advisors are pretty locked into their communities. What can they do to support vulnerable businesses? And that doesn't mean we're talking about mines. We're talking about maybe retailers in a formerly busy community. What can they do to help businesses or advise them and change hearts and minds in a community?
I think one thing we need to understand about the accounting space is not all accountants work for large corporates, right? We do have a sizable S&P, small to medium enterprise population out there. One of the things that came out as part of the lockdown process that Victoria and Australia went through was that advisors or accountants, when they were speaking to their clients, the clients would not even want to talk about business. They would want to talk about, I'm not fine, I'm not okay, I'm struggling. And it was almost as if they used their accountants to also be therapists at that point in time. And that's the relationship piece, right? That's how accountants position themselves within the S&P space, is they are advisors, they're trusted friends. There is a bond that happens there. If we look at the bigger end of town in terms of planning, so if we come back to the whole planning piece, right? I think accountants do have a technical baseline, and we're beholden to the technical skills that we've been given and have developed over many, many years. On top of that, I think there's also the capability that accountants have of viewing problems holistically. We realize that it's not only about dollars and cents. We also factor in a whole host of non-financial information. And, this has been part and parcel of being an accountant for many, many years. So I think that ability to view the problem not only from a financial impact, but also start thinking about social impacts is something which squarely sits with the profession, particularly if you're doing, a project plan or thinking about how do we transition. Let's take a mining example to make it a bit more concrete. So if we're going through that stage of saying, this is the financial plan from decommissioning to rehabilitation, right? So, and you're applying dollars to that. It's how do you start building into that particular plan societal considerations. And that's something which sits squarely with the accounting space, because we report not only on financials, we report on non-financial information as well. So I think that's an area where we can play. The other point I just wanted to raise was, I spoke about the education piece, right? So how do we do that education piece? And I mentioned it would be good if there's a quantum applied to that. So if government can say, okay, fine, we're applying X amount of million of dollars to make sure that that education happens. Accountants play in that field. It's up to us to define that number and to make sure that it's robust enough to cover this whole transition that we're trying to do. So again, we can play into that particular kind of field. But I think as an accountant, it's the advocacy that you can add as well. So starting to talk about these things, just in your normal kind of position, it doesn't matter where you are on your career scale. It's having these conversations, making sure people are aware that it's a broader issue than just money.
I know we talked a bit about government, but what else are they doing to ensure a just transition?
So there is, as I mentioned before, there is a component of the Powering Australia policy is looking in terms of regional Australia. So there is that understanding that outside of the big metropoles, we need to think about, how do we take the regions along? Because we are talking about substantial changes here. Yes. These are not just tinkering around the edges. We spoke about the education piece, which, if government can get that right, that would be wonderful. There's also a recognition, I think, more broadly that it's not good enough for Australia to get it right as a country without thinking about our neighbours. We are based in Asia. We're also based in Oceania. So therefore, we need to start thinking about how do we do this collectively. In Asia and in Oceania, we have a bit of a disadvantage in as much as we don't have something like the EU or a comparable mechanism format.
Like a real economic community.
Yeah, there's not that level of collective push. So it's how do we take everyone along on the journey? Now, if you think about our Pacific neighbours, so places like Fiji, Samoa, these kind of jurisdictions are going to see and are already starting to see the biggest impacts from climate change. If you think about rising sea levels and all these kind of things, that impact on them. We're also aware that those jurisdictions don't necessarily have the deeper pockets that places like Australia and New Zealand has, right? And the government's made it abundantly clear that not only is it good enough for us to transition, we need to take our neighbours along on the journey. We know that adaptation is going to be the big issue for them, in as much as how do you adapt your societies to living with less land, because that's effectively what's going to happen. And how do you then back fund that? So it's how can Australia also be acting not only to its own benefit, but also to the benefit of the region more broadly. And the government's been very open about that is their focus and that is their approach. It's not only an Australia first perspective, it is more about our neighbours as well and making sure that all of us can move forward. Because it would be a crying shame if we could pat ourselves on the back and say, yay, we've done it, but
we are actually part of an entire world that's being affected by climate change. We're not isolated. So
correct. And it does come back to this, and I'm not going to say it's wrong or right, but it's just different. It does come back to this Western concept of thinking it's more about the individual. We have to break that because it's not about the individual. Yeah. It's about the community and broader kind of thinking.
Absolutely. Lastly, can I just ask you are an accountant.
I am,
and
yes.
You are passionate about ESG and sustainability issues. How would you encourage your fellow accountants to get excited about a carbon neutral future for themselves, for their own businesses, and for their clients?
Yep. My previous employer, and I'm not going to say who I previously worked for, you can find that online, but I remember the CEO at that point of the organisation, he used to say this 25 times a week: there has never been a more exciting time to be an accountant. And we would always have a slight giggle at that because, it's a bit passé. But it's not. It's about the fact that, accounting has moved on beyond just the numbers. Yeah. That is still our bread and butter, and that won't change in the foreseeable future. But what we are starting to see is the incorporation of more non-financial kind of information. And there's a need for accountants to play in that field of how do we bring all of these things together. And who would have thought that, years ago when I was growing up, and I mentioned this earlier before we started this recording, I grew up in the era of Captain Planet, where I was like wanting to be Captain Planet and all these kind of things, childhood fantasies. And now it's starting to become reality because my technical skills is now starting to intersect with my concern for nature, concern for people. Those two are now finding this happy marriage in between. And this is exciting. I mean, it's really exciting that you can bring passion outside of just the numbers and that absolute joy you have when a trial balance balances, but you can take that one step further and, the broader kind of things that I'm thinking about now becomes part of my work. That's very, very exciting.
Well, Patrick, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Jackie.
For more information about Just Transition and the full story of Germany's Viljoen coal mine, don't forget to check our show notes for this episode.
If you've enjoyed this episode, help others discover In the Black by leaving us a review and sharing this episode with colleagues, clients, or anyone else interested in leadership, strategy, and business. To find out more about our other podcasts, check out the show notes for this episode. We hope you can join us again next time for another episode of In the Black.